office is the influence of money on campaigns. In a new memoir, the former president calls the removal of restrictions on campaign contributions after the Supreme Court Citizen United ruling tragic. He says if he had run for office under those same rules, he would not have been a successful candidate. The title of President Carter's new book is A Full Life, Reflections at 90. President Jimmy Carter joins me in the studio. You can see live video streaming of our conversation with the president at drshow.org. You can call us on 800-433-8850. If you'd like to join the conversation, you can email us at drshow@wamu.org. You can find us on Facebook or Twitter. And Mr. President, welcome again.
Diane, it's always good to be with you and millions of people that listen to your program.
Do you know that we checked yesterday and today is the 11th time you have appeared on this program?
Well, I'm delighted. I come every time you let me come and I have a chance.
I'm so pleased. Well, I'm wondering what your thinking is about South Carolina legislature's action, vote finally to take down the Confederate flag. How do you believe that will affect the persistent racism in this country?
Well, the same thing was done by Georgia 14 years ago by a very courageous Democratic governor named Roy Barnes. And because of that, he was defeated for re-election. And that was almost the only reason given by the voters. And I think it's a very good and long overdue step for South Carolina to take. It was difficult for many of them to vote for it, but I believe it will be at least a small move toward a realization in our country that racial superiority of white people has been over. We thought we had this battle won back in the 60s and 70s. And I think the recent publicity given to police abuse of black people and the horrible events in Charleston, South Carolina have shown that we have a long way to go.
I'd like to ask you about another current event, which is our ongoing negotiations with Iran. Are we approaching this in the right way?
I think so. I have complete confidence in John Kerry. I believe he's a courageous and very knowledgeable and experienced man. He's one of the best secretaries of state we've ever had. And I believe that if an agreement is concluded with John Kerry in charge of the American position, that it will be a sound and enforceable conclusion to a very great threat. And it'll be good for Iran, good for the United States, and good for the entire world.
There has been a lot of pushback from Republicans on the Hill.
Well, that's true. The only alternative to working this out is a very strong likelihood of armed conflict between the United States and Iran. And that's something that none of us want.
And there's also been a lot of pushback against the negotiations from Israel.
Well, Israel would like for the United States to fight that part of the battle for them. I don't think, knowing what I do know about the military, Israel would not have the capability itself with the weapons that they have to make a definitive and substantive attacks 1,200 miles away. They don't have the long-range bombers. They don't have the refueling capability. So any military attack on Iran that would be long-lasting in its permanent effect would almost have to be launched by the United States.
So you believe that that's why Israel is so concerned about these ongoing negotiations?
Well, I know that Israel has multiple reasons for being concerned, and I certainly understand many of those concerns. But I think their expression of those concerns by Netanyahu have been overly dramatic and sometimes departing from the facts. And I believe that he has been successful in convincing a lot of the members of the U.S. Congress particularly the Republican side. But what President Obama and John Kerry are trying to do is the right thing.
I think our listeners should know that this is not simply a written memoir that you've brought out, but it is, in fact, one that includes your paintings. Tell me about your paintings. I love them.
Well, I began painting when I was still in the Navy back in the 1950s. And since then, I've painted off and on, and I really enjoy it. I'm primarily a woodworker. I have a wood shop that's completely furnished, and I design and build furniture. And that was what I did for many years, along with writing books since I left the White House. But in the last 10 or 15 years, I've set up a very good easel in the corner of my wood shop. So when I'm not building furniture and when the air is not full of sawdust, I can paint with relative impunity. Primarily, I like to paint with oils. I used to paint with acrylics and oils, but that's what I do now. And it's really a great pleasure for me. And some of the products of my painting, I give to the Carter Center to be auctioned off, and so the very high prices that come from my paintings go to the Carter Center.
One recently went for something like $250,000.
And another one 2 weeks ago went for that same amount. Yes.
Wow. Congratulations.
Well, the money doesn't go to me, obviously, but
obviously,
it helps the Carter Center.
But really, for your paintings, another congratulations is due you and Mrs. Carter on your 69th wedding
Well, thank you for that. Well, we've had a good life, and I wrote about that a good bit in the book, and how our relationship changed after about 15 or 20 years. The first part of our marriage, I was in the Navy, and I patterned my own married life after my father's and other men that I knew. I've made all the major decisions, and I approached the decisions very carefully because I knew it affected my whole family, particularly Rosalynn. And I would just announce to her what the decision had been. And she accepted it, except in one particular case, when I decided to leave the Navy, she was very angry and she was very disappointed in me. And she stayed disturbed or pouting, she says, for almost a year.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, we left Schenectady in New York, where I was working on a nuclear submarine for Admiral Rickover. And we drove about 700 miles or more down to Plains, Georgia. And she never spoke to me on the way.
Oh.
And if she wanted to communicate with me, she would tell my oldest son, Jack, tell your father I need to stop at the restroom.
Who was in the back of the car?
He was in the back of the car.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Well, she eventually got over it. But I learned after that period in my life, in my married life, that I needed her. And I began more and more to realize that in making the major decisions of life, that her judgment was just as good, at least as good as mine. And so in the political realm, along with our business and so forth and our family affairs, Rosalynn is much more, I'd say, acclimated to it and more attracted to it than I am. I think she's a better politician than I am. She likes it more than I do. She likes the strategy, the tactics, the fundraising techniques, the speech preparation, and the consequences of political life, maybe more than I do. And so she was always urging me when I was in the White House to let her know about the details of what was going on.
She used to get in on cabinet meetings.
That was a final solution. The first intermediate solution was just to have a 1 hour or so luncheon with her every Wednesday, so she could just ask me questions about public affairs. And I finally said, Rosa, why don't you just come and sit in on the cabinet meeting? So she does that. She did that for the last year or two of our presidential life.
You know, there's a passage in the book where you talk about the fact that the two of you tried to write a book together.
Oh, that was horrible.
And that was horrible.
It was.
What happened?
That was the worst challenge to the integrity of our marriage. It really was. We had agreed to write a book together. And so we started, and we had a nice advance from a publishing company. And we divided the chapters. and she wrote one chapter, I wrote the other. I write very rapidly, and Rosalynn writes very slowly, very carefully. And when I would finish my chapter and give it to her to edit, she would look on it as just a rough draft, you know. And so, but when she gave me her copy, it was as though she had just received it from Mount Sinai, and God had carved the words in stone, and it was actually painful for her to change an adjective or anything in a sentence that she had carefully composed. And we also had a difference of memory about things that had happened in our early life, and different reaction to things. Sometimes I would think something was kind of funny, and she would think it was more serious, and so forth. And we got so we couldn't even speak to each other. And so we finally decided to give up the book, but our editor resurrected it.
Former President Jimmy Carter, his new book is titled A Full Life, Reflections at 90. We are going to take your calls. I look forward to hearing from you. With your wife, Rosalynn, and how you just were two different people in writing.
Well, we finally got so we couldn't even speak to each other about the book. We just wrote ugly emails back and forth on the computer, and we decided to give the book up. And so we notified our editor and our publisher that we would give the advance money back and cancel the book. And so our editor, Peter Osnos, came down to Plains, and he said, "Why don't you let me try one more time to referee between you?" and I said, "This is hopeless." He said, "No, you pick out the paragraphs in the book on which you cannot agree, and give them to me." So he stayed there a couple of days, and he got all the paragraphs on which we had an argument, and he gave me half of them and Rosalynn half of the paragraphs. And he said, "Okay, Jimmy, you write your paragraph. Rosalynn cannot edit, and vice versa." So in the book, which was published, you can read the book, and every now and then you'll see a paragraph with either a J or an R by it, and those are the paragraphs on which we could not agree. So it was.
But the book got published.
Yeah, but we'll never do that again.
Never.
But she's still my best editor, and when I finish a manuscript, including this one, I give it to Rosalynn to go over, and I really pay close attention to what she says. But we'll never try to share the power and authority and autocracy of trying to write a book together.
Mr. President, here you are at age 90, just as sharp and clear and strong as ever, and yet you have a 50-year-old son who has Parkinson's disease.
I do. He's been fortunate in that it's a milder form of Parkinson's, and he's got a medicine that he takes now quite regularly. And he has a trembling of his left arm particularly and his legs sometimes. And he has to be very careful about his daily regimen, what he eats and that sort of thing. But he's so far not had the extreme consequences of Parkinson's.
Does he live with you? Does he?
No, he lives by himself. He has a family of his own. He has a wife and 3 sons, 2 of whom are grown. All of them are grown now. The youngest one is just finishing college coming up.
But thinking about you at age 90, you haven't slowed down at all.
No, this has been a very busy year.
Guyana, Russia, the Middle East.
That's right.
What do you think is going to happen in the Middle East? What are we doing right and what are we doing wrong?
At this moment, we're not doing anything. And this is the first time that I've known since Israel was founded, when the United States has practically no influence in Jerusalem or in the Palestinian area. And the government in Israel has made it fairly clear with their composition and with their public statements that they no longer adhere to the commitment to honor United Nations Resolution 242 or to carry out a 2-state solution. And unfortunately, even though the United States has created a vacuum by withdrawing as a potential mediator, the European countries have not yet been willing to move in and take over that responsibility. So I would say now practically no hope of any immediate move toward reconciliation between Israel and its immediate neighbors. The Carter Center, however, because of my particular interest, we have a full-time office in Jerusalem and also in Ramallah in the West Bank and also in Gaza. So we constantly probe for any possibility to open up a new avenue, and we stay in close touch with other officials, including those in the State Department of the United States, when we see a possibility for a movement. But at this point, the situation seems to be almost completely hopeless. The movement that is being taken now is by the Palestinians on their own initiative, by moving toward the United Nations and toward the International Criminal Court to try to bring the situation to a judicial decision. But I don't think that's going to have any ultimate success.
And what about the steps that the United States is trying to take to rein in ISIS?
I don't think we're making much progress. The news media, and that's only source of information I have, is just what I read in the news, indicates that in some weeks ISIS makes further moves, particularly in Iraq. In other weeks we take over maybe one small town and so forth. But I understand that recently President Obama has met with his top advisors to see what kind of new course to take. As you know, we have very carefully avoid any so-called boots on the ground or troops directly involved. We have probably an inadequate degree of observers on the ground who can actually orient our pinpoint bombing and missiles and so forth. And we don't have any working cooperation with the main opponents of ISIS, which is Iran. So Iran is fighting alongside the government of Iraq, and the United States is basically channeling our weaponry and help through the Iraqi government. And I think and hope we will begin to give more directly to the Kurds and others who are willing to fight. The basic problem is, unfortunately, that the ISIS troops are willing to give their lives with freedom and sometimes with enthusiasm for their cause, and their opponents don't have the same degree of commitment.
Do you believe President Obama has handled the situation as well as he could, not very well, or brilliantly?
I think the first two. I think he's handled it the best he could and not very well. But I can't say that he could have done much better because he's tightly constrained by his own public statements and commitments to get out of Iraq, to get out of Afghanistan as quickly as possible, with which some people disagree. And he also has been uh, publicly stating himself that he has no workable long-term strategy to pursue. But I think that's understandable because I think ISIS kind of came out of nowhere, and the massive flood of ISIS troops out of Syria and into Iraq was a surprise to, I think, everybody. And the degree of success was good. And the main reason they had success was because many of the Sunni Muslims who live in that part of Iraq were already alienated from the from the central government in Baghdad, and so that division within the Muslims and who are Iraqis has been a very serious problem. But eventually, I believe that can be marshaled enough combined support from all the Arabs over there, and with our technical and strategic and intelligence support, and with our aerial bombing to prevail against ISIS.
You do. You were optimistic.
I'm cautiously optimistic because most of the public statements by President Obama and by secretaries of defense and so forth that we're going to make immediate or dramatic improvements or do away with them or have not been successful.
How do you think the press has treated President Obama?
I think in general, okay. I think they've given him credit when he's been in health programs and so forth, and other domestic programs. I think they've given him a lot of support when he's spoken out publicly and increasingly effectively and increasingly emotionally too about the race issue still extant in this country. There obviously some press like Fox News who don't like anything he does. There are other television programs like MSNBC that likes everything he does, and others in between. But I think in general he's gotten as good a coverage from the press as I did, or maybe better.
How do you think the press treated you? Fairly or otherwise?
I think otherwise. There have been scholarly analyses done and published about the coverage that I had in the 48 months that I was in the White House. I got positive coverage 2 months, and I got unfavorable publicity 46 months. Even in the month when I reached a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, the press was negative in an objective analysis.
I want to refer our listeners, because I know you've already seen it, this morning's column by Nicholas Kristof in this New York Times today, and I'm quoting here. He says, "The press and chattering class have often been merciless to Carter. Early on, cartoons mocked him as a country rube, using an outhouse or associating with pigs. Writers pilloried him as a sanctimonious hick, and in recent years, it has been common to hear that he's anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. This about the man whose Camp David Accord ensured Israel's future." Now that Carter is 90 and has been an ex-president longer than anyone in history, it's time to correct the record. He is anything but an empty suit. And now I'll skip to the last paragraph. Carter, says Kristof, the one-termer who was a pariah in his own party, may well have improved the lives of more people in more places over a longer period of time than any other recent president. So we, in the snooty media world, owe him an apology. Quote, "We were wrong about you, Mr. President. You're not a lightweight at all, and we can't wait to see what you'll do in your next 90 years." I love that.
Well, I obviously don't disagree with what he has to say in his
You
article.
must have been pleased to read that.
Well, I really was.
Finally.
Nick has been a good friend of ours, and he's a champion of protecting the rights of women and girls. And not only that, but he has a unique ability as a columnist and as a news reporter to go into the most intimate relationships with people who suffer most around the world. So I've been one of his admirers for many years, and he's been with us on some of our trips into different remote areas of Africa to deal with diseases that not many other people know about.
Former President Jimmy Carter, his new book is A Full Life, Reflections at 90. And you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. And speaking of women and girls, Mr. President, we have a tweet from Liz who says, "How important is it that we soon get a Madam President? And what impact do you see Hillary having when she's elected?" So reads the tweet.
Well, I'm not going to predict the outcome of the election, but I don't think there's any doubt that Hillary Clinton has been a champion of women's rights for a long time, even when she was First Lady and went to the major United Nations conference on that subject when her husband was president. So there have been women leaders who have not been helpful to the women's rights. Indira Gandhi, for instance, when she was Prime Minister of India, my mother happened to be in the Peace Corps in India, and she resented very deeply the grief that came on some of the women in her Peace Corps area because of the policies of Mrs. Gandhi. And others have taken over as head of governments like in Nicaragua that very carefully avoided any reference to the rights of women when they were in office because they didn't want to embarrass themselves by showing prejudice. So I think it still remains to be seen whether just having a president who's a woman will help women more than have a man who's equally determined to do.
What about in the broader sense, having a woman hold that office that has never in this country been held by a woman?
It'll be quite significant to the entire world to see. The United States now has a very low percentage of women elected to public office compared to the rest of the world. We have now, when I was president, we had about 3% of the members of Congress who were women. Now it's come up to roughly 15%. I may not have the exact figure, but that's roughly right. The world average is 23%. So we're way behind the world average. And some countries have more than half the total number of top parliamentarians in the country who are female. And so it goes from one extreme to the other. And of course, most of the Arab countries, some of the Arab countries have no women that are even permitted to vote. In Saudi Arabia, a woman has never voted for any person to hold public office. They're contemplating now that women might have a chance to vote in the next election for local officials. But so you have the extremes.
Do you think Hillary Clinton would make a good president?
Well, I think so. I think it's quite likely, maybe almost inevitable, that she's going to be the Democratic nominee. And if so, I'll be delighted to support her.
What do you make of this wide-ranging slate of candidates for the Republican nomination?
I think they see, first of all, that they have a good chance to win, and I wouldn't deny that. But I think the Republican Party is kind of searching for the essence of what it believes. In the past, it's been quite clear. Like when I was in ancient times when I was running for public office, when president, we knew what the Republican Party stood for. And I got along quite well with them, by the way. I got just as much support from Republicans in the Congress as I did the Democrats. But I think now the Republican Party is on the opposite side from a lot of things that the American people believe. For instance, a recent decision by the Supreme Court on gay marriage. The Republicans on the other side, 60% of the Americans on this side. I think the Republicans are almost hidebound to deny that, I'd say, scientific facts like global warming and even other things of that kind, which I need not mention. And they also against dealing with the immigration crisis. So they're on the opposite side from a lot of things. So they're struggling for ways to express themselves.
Former President Jimmy Carter. And when we come back, we'll take calls. You can watch the program as we video stream. Stay with us. And welcome back. Certainly in Jimmy Carter's new book, A Full Life, Reflections at 90, he talks very lovingly about his father. There was one incident, Mr. President, that you might just talk about and then read us the poem that came out of that.
All right. Well, my father was a very strict disciplinarian, and he punished severely when I needed it. And I remember all 5 times when he gave me a spanking. And my daddy expected very high things from me, and he didn't accept any sort of slackered my attitude toward going to the field, working, and so forth. And I was worshipped my father, and I tried every way I could to accommodate him. And but when he punished me, I was very quickly after that I got over my animosity because he had punished me. And so later on, I wrote a poem.
But before you tell us about that poem or read it to us, tell us what happened to your wrist.
My wrist. Well, we had a bunch of chickens in the yard, and every now and then Mother would want to have fried chicken for supper for Sunday noon, and she would send me out to kill a chicken. And I used to run it down, and I would hit the chicken and finally kill the chicken. And one time I struck down, and instead of hitting the chicken, I hit the top of a cut off stiff weed, and the weed went into my wrist, in the joint of my wrist, and the doctors and planes were not able to get it out. And so it got more and more festered and swollen and incapacitated me. So I couldn't go to the field and work. And I wanted to, but I couldn't. And so one day my father came to the living room when I was lying on my stomach reading a book, which I always did. And he said, well, I guess the rest of us will go to the field and work today while Jimmy reads his book. And he walked out, and I was distressed that my father had disapproved of me. So I went out in the backyard, and I took my belt off, and I tied my hand to a post so it couldn't move. And I raised up my arm more and more. And finally, the pus encapsulated end of a stick came out of my wrist, and I very quickly got my mother to dress it. She was a nurse, and I ran out in the field eager to work with my father. So I tried every way I could to make sure that he approved what I was doing.
Did he acknowledge your presence once you got out?
Of course he did, yeah. Well, he was glad to see me help him in the field, along with the other people who were working there.
Now read for us your beautiful poem.
And this is one of the poems I wrote. I wanted to share my father's world. This is a pain I mostly hide, but ties of blood or seed endure. And even now I feel inside the hunger for his outstretched hand, a man's embrace to take me in, the need for just a word of praise. I despise the discipline he used to shape what I should be, not owning up that he might feel his own pain when he punished me. I didn't show my need to him, since his response to an appeal would not have meant as much to me or been as real. From those rare times when we did cross a bridge between us, the poor joy survives. I never put aside the past resentments of the boy until, with my own sons, I shared his final hours and came to see what he had become or always was, the father who will never cease to be alive in me.
Just beautiful. I'm glad you wrote that.
Well, I found out when I began to write more poems that I can say things in a poem that would be impossible for me to say verbally or in prose.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I just can let down the barriers that might exist or reticence about communicating with another person when I go off by myself and just kind of let my mind run free and write down the essence of a poem and then finally put it into, cogent words.
I wonder if you remember the last time you were on this program and you were talking about some of the strains that had been in your marriage with Rosalynn. And I had the goal to ask you whether you and she had ever considered divorce. Do you remember that?
I don't remember that specific instant, but
I had to wait 10 seconds of silence before you responded. And then you said to me, yes, Diane, we did. And then I said, so what did you do next? I had to wait through 10 more seconds of silence. And you said, we got down on our knees and prayed.
I remember that. I remember you asking that, yes. And we did. And that's something every night, the last thing we do is try to resolve any differences we've had during the time, which is not always easy. But we make it easier because for the last 40 years, we've never missed a night reading the Bible at the end of our day. And one night she reads aloud, and the next night I read aloud. And more than half the time we read it in Spanish, just to practice our Spanish. So that gives us a chance to think about, greater things than just the idiosyncrasies of each other and the inabilities to agree on every item in our daily lives.
Marriage is such a long and complicated journey.
It is, and a gratifying one.
And a gratifying one. All right, let's open the phones now. 800-433-8850. Let's go first to Jean in Union, Kentucky. You're on the air.
Hello, President Carter. What an honor to speak with you. On my short list of heroes, you have the number one spot.
Thank you, Jean.
I just want to thank you for always showing us the way. You don't just tell us, but you've acted. You and Mrs. Carter, you have acted the many years since you've been president. I love that Diane read that passage today from the New York Times. I love the last paragraph. It's what we've known all along. But you've always taught us to stand up for what is right in the world.
I really appreciate your call, and I'm sure you do.
I do
too.
too. That's wonderful. Yes.
Indeed. Let's go to Tony in St. Petersburg, Florida. You're on the air.
Thank you, Diane. It's a pleasure, and it's a pleasure to hear President Carter on your show. My father was an admirer of President Carter also, as I am. I think leadership should unite people, and that's something that President Carter has always done, not only when he was president, but after he left the presidency. And he's worked tirelessly towards peace, and I think that's a very, very important goal, and in uniting people and in helping people throughout the world. And I commend him for his work, not only as president, but after his presidency. So I think he's a shining example of the best modern-day president we've ever had.
Well,
And I would like to ask him what he thinks of the situation in Cuba right now.
I'm delighted to see that finally we are moving toward full diplomatic relations with Cuba. I wanted to do the same thing when I was in the White House, and I removed all the travel restraints on Americans then and began working with Fidel Castro from a distance to do the same thing. And we established interest sections, and we now have in the former embassy in Havana about 300 Americans working there on behalf of our country, and he has a large number in Washington as well. But we never were able to go to full diplomatic relations, and I hope that very soon we'll see President Obama do this, which is a privilege that he has under the Constitution, and also that he'll relieve the Cuban people from the unwarranted embargo or sanctions economically that we've imposed on them.
Here's an email from Ricardo about the situation in Venezuela. Your opinion of the hunger strikes by political dissidents that force the Maduro government into setting a date for elections. Do you plan to participate as an observer?
The Carter Center has participated in 100 elections in the world, 4 of which have been in Venezuela. And they've all been when Cesar Chavez was the president or becoming president. And they've been very honest elections. They've been fair. But under the present circumstances, Maduro has not seen fit to invite in international observers to monitor the conduct of the election. And I would guess that he will not invite the Carter Center to come in either. If he does invite us, and if it's obvious to us that the major parties can have equal opportunity to win an election, if the people vote their way, then we would certainly go.
All right. And to Julie in Cedar, Michigan, you're on the air.
Good morning, Diane and President Carter. My question is what your thoughts are on the Bernie Sanders movement, as well as why there's very little press, the news organizations aren't really talking about him as much. I know he's been on your show, Diane, and
yes,
and such, but you don't really hear about him as much.
Oh my goodness! I think there has been a great deal of publicity about Bernie Sanders. Well deserved with the crowds he's drawing.
I think so. The social media, though, has been much greater percentage of coverage for Bernie Sanders than for Hillary. And the news media, established news media, has been much greater percentage for Hillary than for Bernie Sanders. So I think that difference is maybe what she refers to. It's an article about that in the morning news, I think either the Washington Post or the New York Times, that I read on the way from New York down here to Washington.
What do you make Bernie Sanders' stands on not only economic equality, various social issues as compared to perhaps those of Hillary Clinton?
I think he is much more attuned toward the plight of the poor people in our country than Hillary was at the beginning. But Senator Warren was the one who spelled out the need to be concerned about the domination of rich people and Wall Street.
Elizabeth Warren.
Yes. And since she's not running, I think Bernie Sanders has kind of filled her shoes. And I think during this campaign, Hillary Clinton has adopted as many of those principles that had been brilliantly expressed and permanently expressed by Elizabeth Warren than she had perhaps in her previous time in the public life. So I think that Hillary has kind of taken over a lot of the premises that have made both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren popular.
And you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. And to Kathleen in Columbus, Ohio, you're on the air.
Thank you. And like the others, President Carter, I just have deep respect and quite honestly love for you and all of your incredible work and examples for us all. So thank you. And I'd like to ask you about non-proliferation and in regard to President Obama's approach with Iran and the P5+1. And do you think that has been a constructive approach? And would you support, or do you think there should be more pressure on Pakistan, India, and Israel to sign the non-proliferation treaty, sir?
Well, the answer to your last question is yes, I certainly do. And those are the countries that don't comply with a non-proliferation treaty. As you know, Iran is a member of a non-proliferation treaty group. But I personally hope and pray that within the next 2 or 3 days, we'll see success between the United States and Iran in forming an agreement. And I have complete confidence that if John Kerry signs an agreement, it will be both enforceable and good for our country and for Iran.
Here's an email from Robert in Chevy Chase, Maryland. Please take a moment to reflect upon your great friendship and working relationship with our late President Gerald Ford.
Well, I would say that Gerald Ford was one of the friends I've ever had in my life. And historians have said that among all the former presidents that ever lived, the closest personal friendship was between me and Gerald Ford, of which I'm very proud. He and I had an easygoing relationship. We got along almost perfectly. His wife was a friend of my wife. Our children were friends with each other.
How did that friendship begin to
It
develop?
began on the way home from Sadat's funeral, because when Sadat was assassinated, neither the president nor the vice president wanted to go. They didn't know what the circumstances were there, and where safety was concerned. But Nixon and Ford and I went. Nixon stayed over in the Mideast, and Ford and I came back on the government plane, and we got to know each other on the way back. And that's where we started. And then we went to each other's libraries and so forth. And about 3 months before President Ford's death, he called me on the phone, which he did every now and then. He said, "My good friend Jimmy, how you doing?" I said, "Fine." He said, "I called to ask you a favor." And I said, "Jerry, I'll do anything that you ask me to within reason." He said, "Well, I want you to promise me that you'll give the eulogy at my funeral." And I was really taken aback. And I thought for a few minutes, and I stumbled, and I said, "Okay, I'll promise to give the eulogy at your funeral if you'll give the eulogy at my funeral." And he said, "Okay." And then 3 months later, he died. And one of the great honors of my life was to give the funeral eulogy.
Do you think he knew he was close to dying?
He was, and I knew too that he was quite ill, because he and I had been very active together in many projects, half Democrat, half Republican, and so forth. And he had withdrawn from that participation, and he told me on the phone that I am just not able to travel around anymore. So I knew that he was more, in trouble physically than he.
I'm glad you agreed to do
I am
that.
too.
Are you working on a new book?
Well, I have some thoughts
Some
in the background. Yeah,
ideas.
some ideas.
That doesn't surprise me at all. Former President Jimmy Carter, what a joy to see you again, to hear you and know how well you are. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Diane. Well, I'm delighted to be with you again, and look
Thank
forward
you.
to the future. Best wishes to you on your new book.
Thank you. Former President Jimmy Carter. His new book is titled A Full Life, Reflections at 90. Thanks for listening all. I'm Diane Rain.
The Diane Rehm